It started with a parking space. Wide, empty lot. Middle of the day. No rush. No reason for conflict. But to the three men standing by the blue pickup, her existence was reason enough. She was black, pregnant, alone, and she parked too close to what they claimed was their row. They didn't ask. They didn't check. They just walked over, circled her like it was sport. Didn't think they let y'all park up here. Where's your husband? Or did he run off? She didn't answer. She just pressed the key fob and unlocked the trunk, trying to lift a bag, without twisting wrong. Then one of them pushed the cart, just enough to hit her. She stumbled. One hand hit the car. The other cradled her belly. Relax, one of them laughed. A little bump builds character. Another added, maybe next time, use the back lot. Then they walked off. High fives. No fear. Like they'd done this before. They didn't notice her white blood from her palm. They didn't see her open her phone. They didn't hear what she whispered into the receiver. But someone else did. 15 miles away, a phone buzzed in a federal building. And the man who answered didn't need to ask who touched his wife. He just said, send me the tapes. All of them. Because what they didn't know was that the woman they shoved was married to the director of the FBI. And by the end of the week, none of them would walk into a store or a courtroom the same way again. Maybe you've seen someone try to act tough in a crowd. Or maybe you've stayed quiet when someone else couldn't. Comment if you've ever watched power show up silently and win. Like this if you know real strength doesn't yell. Share it, because next time, they might think twice. Her name was Selah, 32 years old, 6 months pregnant, and not new to the weight of silence. She didn't grow up soft, but she did grow up smart. The kind of smart that teaches you when to look away and when to stand your ground. The kind of smart that knows there are battles you fight and battles you record. That day at the parking lot, Selah didn't shout. She didn't curse. She didn't swing. She remembered everything. Selah had been raised in South Carolina, moved to D.C. for school, worked her way through 2 degrees, one job, and then another. She'd built a small life with her husband, Caden, in a quiet neighborhood. No marble counters. No bragging rights. Just safety. Caden liked order. He was built for it. Ex-military, now federal. But it was Selah who taught him what quiet dignity looked like. It was her who reminded him. Not all wounds bleed, but all of them echo. So when the shove came and her back hit the car, her first instinct wasn't panic. It was protocol. She'd been trained, not formally, but by experience. She turned her body sideways, absorbed the fall, protected the belly, hit the ground on her elbow, not her spine, then stood up, without a word, without a tear, just a phone in her hand, dialing one number, the only one that mattered, Director King's office. It's Selah. The voice on the other end didn't ask anything else, just said, we're on it. By the time Selah sat in her car, her palms still red and knees scraped beneath the fabric of her dress, for security feeds were already being pulled from the parking lot. 2 vehicles were flagged, the blue Dodge Ram with a license plate from out of state, and a black Honda Civic with a cracked taillight. Faces were matched through a federal facial recognition protocol, usually reserved for missing persons and terror watch lists. But this time, it was personal. This time, it was the FBI director's wife. Selah drove home slowly. Didn't listen to music. Didn't cry. Just kept breathing, counting kicks in her belly, with one hand resting gently over the curve of it. She knew how the world worked, especially for women like her. A black woman with a baby on the way, standing alone in a parking lot. To them, she was just a scenario, an inconvenience, a body in the wrong place. But not today. Today, she wasn't the one who had to prove anything. Back home, she walked through the front door. Caden was already there. His badge was on the table, his jacket folded, his laptop open. He didn't rush her. He just stood, waited. She nodded once, and he knew. They didn't hug right away. They just stood in the kitchen, 2 people who understood each other without performing grief. Selah finally said, 3 of them, older, white. One shoved me. I didn't fall all the way. Protected the baby. Caden nodded. We've got the plate. Another pause. Selah walked to the sink, washed the dried blood off her palm, then dried her hands and turned back. I don't want revenge. I know, but I want them to never forget what they touched. The next morning, Caden walked into the Bureau headquarters with no suit, just jeans, boots, and a shirt that read FBI Dad. No one asked questions. His team had already started compiling. He didn't need to issue orders. They knew what this was. Not personal vengeance, but justice with a timestamp. Meanwhile, Selah stayed home. Not idle. Not shaken. She filed an incident report. Clean, clear, professional. She made tea. Answered emails. Wrote 2 thank you notes to friends. And then she wrote something else. A list of every time she'd been overlooked, disrespected, doubted. Not to shame, but to remember. Because this wasn't just about a parking lot. This was about a pattern. Back at the Bureau, the evidence came fast. Multiple angles. License plate confirmation. Audio enhancement. The shove was clear. So were the words. People like, you always think you're owed something. Bet you're on welfare. Or is that baby your ticket? One of the men had said that last part with a laugh. Now his face was paused on a 4K screen in a federal building. Caden stared at the image. Didn't blink. Didn't say a word. Just wrote one thing on a yellow sticky note. Find out where he works. Find out who signs his paycheck. And so they did. By the end of the day, one man was identified as a former corrections officer with past disciplinary warnings. Another was a contractor with a federal security clearance, which now triggered a review. The third was a church deacon with a sealed juvenile record, which became unsealed once assault was involved. 3 names. 3 files. 3 doors opening the wrong way. Selah watched the sunset from her porch. No headline yet. No statement. Just calm. And the kind of storm that brews not in thunder, but in data. The first system they walked into was legal. But not courtrooms. Not yet. It started with databases. Names, faces, connections, cross-referenced. Caden didn't have to break the law to hold them accountable. He just had to know where to look. The first man, Russell Kane, had worked for a private security firm contracting with federal buildings. He was on assignment at a VA hospital the same day he shoved Selah, which meant he'd violated federal ethics protocol by being involved in a pending criminal incident during an active contract. That alone triggered an internal compliance review. His badge was frozen within 48 hours. His contract under audit. The second, David McKinley, had a background that flagged quietly. He wasn't a criminal, but he was careless. Unpaid debts, restraining order filed, and dropped by an ex-girlfriend. Multiple social media posts expressing racial frustration. Enough to warrant review under digital bias clauses in workplace policy. He worked for a federal shipping contractor. And his clearance. Flagged. The third, Tom Irwin, was the loudest. The one who made the baby ticket comment. He volunteered at a community center, coached Little League, and once ran for local office. But he also had 3 sealed complaints filed against him from a high school teacher job he left a decade ago. They were sealed. Until now. The Bureau didn't leak the names, didn't post pictures, but the gears had started moving, and the system was already reacting. Russell Kane was called into a routine compliance meeting. He showed up in khakis and a golf shirt, walked out with a suspension notice and a federal agent waiting by his car. David McKinley received an email from HR. As part of our security clearance renewal process, you are under internal review and will be placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending resolution. He showed the email to his wife. She asked him one question. Did you do something? He didn't answer. Tom Irwin's reckoning was different. He was approached by a reporter, off the record. She'd received a tip. Not from the Bureau, but from someone inside the community center who'd seen the security footage online. Not the full clip, but the freeze frame of Tom's face as he laughed. That was enough. She connected the dots. Approached him outside a gas station. He denied everything. Then stormed off. By the end of the week, Russell's firm terminated his contract. David's federal access was revoked. Tom's community center paused all of his programs, pending formal review. None of it was public, but it didn't have to be, because the people who'd laughed in a parking lot now walked a little quieter, checked their inboxes more often, jumped when unknown numbers called. Selah didn't ask for updates. She didn't need them. Kayden gave her only what she wanted to know, that the men had names, that those names were now attached to consequences, and that the system had begun to do what it rarely does, move for someone like her. But this wasn't about punishment. Not for Selah. It was about clarity, about showing her unborn child that dignity, once bruised, doesn't disappear. It sharpens. It grows edges. And sometimes it pushes back, in a language the system finally understands. The push was already too far. But it wasn't the only line they crossed. It was what came after. What they said. What they laughed about. What they didn't know was being recorded, not by Selah, but by a parked SUV 2 rows over, with a dashcam facing the incident. A mother sat inside that SUV, feeding her baby, waiting for her husband to come back with groceries. She didn't know what she was witnessing at first, but when she saw the shove, when she saw Selah go down, she hit record, not realizing her car had been recording the whole thing already. She uploaded the clip anonymously to a local neighborhood app, just to warn people. Within 12 hours, the video had 74,000 views. Within 24, it hit federal channels. Not because it was trending, but because one of the viewers worked in the same building as Kayden. And she didn't just watch. She forwarded it directly to Internal Affairs, with a subject line that said, "Is this who we're protecting?" Kayden didn't flinch when he saw the video. He didn't pause it. He didn't rewind. He watched once, then walked down the hallway to a conference room. He locked the door, pulled up a file, and submitted a formal ethics complaint against all 3 men. Not for what they did in the lot, for what the system failed to do afterward. That video, just under a minute, became the quiet detonator no one expected. A prosecutor saw it. So did an agent from the Civil Rights Division. And then, finally, so did the press. Someone leaked it, not from inside the FBI, but from the neighborhood app itself. A user reposted it to Twitter, then Reddit. Then national news picked it up. The caption was simple. She didn't fight back, but someone's about to fight for her. Kayden never confirmed anything publicly. He didn't tweet, didn't grant interviews. But behind closed doors, the push turned into something else entirely. The Civil Rights Division opened a federal probe, not into the men themselves, but into patterns. Patterns of racial targeting in suburban spaces. Patterns of leniency toward white male violence. Patterns of law enforcement looking away when victims don't scream. 1 week after the shove, a letter was delivered to each of the 3 men. Official. Stamped. From the Office of Federal Investigations and Misconduct Review. It wasn't a summons. It was a notice of review. Attached were copies of the dashcam footage. Still shots of each man's face. Highlighted dialogue. Time stamps. And one line at the bottom of each letter. You are entitled to legal representation. You are not entitled to impunity. Selah never asked to see the footage. She didn't need to. She'd already lived it. But one night, as Kayden sat beside her on the couch, she asked, "Do they know yet what they triggered?" Kayden looked at her. "No, but they will. Not because I'm coming for them. Because the system they trusted to protect them is the one they'll have to face now." Selah nodded. She reached for her tea, felt the baby shift, and whispered, more to herself than anyone, "They didn't just touch me. They touched everything I stand for." And this time, everything would push back. They didn't show up to the courthouse in suits. They didn't get the chance. By the time federal agents arrived at each of their homes, they weren't greeted with headlines or sirens. Just quiet knocks. Russell Kane was pulled from his backyard during a barbecue, still wearing an apron. David McKinley was escorted from his job site without handcuffs, but in full view of his entire team. Tom Irwin was found at church. He tried to smile when the agents approached. That smile vanished the second he saw the badge. "We're not here to talk. We're here to file." Inside the folder handed to him, a federal civil rights complaint, a notice of pending indictment, and a request to appear before a federal mediator. This wasn't about jail. Not yet. This was about record, about process, and about power. Finally walking through a door it had been kept out of for too long. Inside the bureau, Caden didn't celebrate. There were no raised glasses, no handshakes, just a hallway of agents nodding to him as he passed. Silent respect. He walked into the legal division with a new document in hand. A motion for classification review. A formal proposal to classify racially motivated non-lethal public assaults against protected groups as hate crimes under an expanded DOJ framework. It wasn't just about these three men. It was about precedent. If the motion passed, what happened to Sayla wouldn't just be misdemeanor battery. It would be a federal offense. Sayla sat across town at a cafe. She wore a soft linen dress and sipped mint tea. Her bump rounded gently under the fabric. A woman from a nearby table leaned over and asked, "Are you the woman from the video?" Sayla turned slowly. She didn't smile, but she didn't flinch. "I'm the woman they tried to erase." The woman blinked. "I'm glad you didn't let them." Sayla said nothing. She didn't need to. At the preliminary hearing, all three men were required to appear. No shackles, no mugshots, just suits and tension. And in the front row sat Sayla. Not angry, not gloating, just present. Her presence was the reckoning. She didn't testify, didn't raise her voice, didn't look away. She simply watched. And the court, for the first time, watched back. After the session, Tom Irwin approached her outside the courthouse. Security tensed. But Sayla raised a hand to let them stand down. He started to speak. She didn't let him finish. "You don't get my forgiveness. You don't get my attention. You only get this moment to realize what you touched." She turned and walked away. Not because she was done, but because her power didn't live in confrontation. It lived in continuation. Caden never asked to be in the same room with them, but the system made space. Mediation day came fast. A private room in a federal building. No cameras, no press, just chairs, folders, and law. Caden sat at the far end of the table. Not as a husband, not even as a victim's representative, but as a federal official delivering findings. Each man entered separately. Each sat without speaking. And then the door closed. On one side, policy. On the other, consequence. Caden opened the file. Spoke slowly. Not as a threat. As record. On April 7th, at approximately 2:42 p.m., you, Mr. Irwin, used your body to intimidate and physically threaten a pregnant civilian during an unprovoked incident. He turned a page. You, Mr. Kane, made physical contact. Shoved her. Audio confirms your statement afterward. A little bump builds character. Another page. And you, Mr. McKinley, laughed and said, "She probably parked here to cash in that belly." He set the file down. No one asked for your opinions. No one invited your touch. And no one will forget what you said. They tried to speak, tried to deny. Kane claimed it was an accident. Irwin blamed stress. McKinley said, "We didn't even know who she was." Caden leaned forward. "That's the problem. You thought she was nobody. But even if she were, the law doesn't scale based on what you think someone's worth." He handed each of them a folder. Inside, their employment reviews, pending federal charges, and a permanent record of the incident filed under hate-motivated conduct. "This doesn't go away when the press dies down," Caden said. "It lives in systems now, like you try to live outside of." Irwin asked, voice trembling, "So what happens to us now?" Caden stood. "That's not up to me. That's up to what you made of yourselves." He left the room, without looking back. Outside, Sayla waited in a car. Windows down. Breeze coming in. Peace on her face. Caden got in. Buckled up. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at him and said, "Let's go." He nodded, and they drove off. Not away, but forward. It started with a phone call. Not to Caden. To someone else. A woman named Adrian, who worked in the Office of Professional Responsibility. She'd been watching from the sidelines, reading the reports, tracking the data, but she hadn't said anything. Not until that dashcam video went public. Not until she saw the shove, the laughter, the indifference. Not until it looked exactly like something she'd seen before. Only that time, It hadn't been Selah. It had been her. Years ago. A grocery store. A comment. A shove. No evidence. No justice. Until now. So Adrian picked up the phone and called a friend in media compliance. "Do you still have that old list?" she asked. "The list of complaints that went nowhere. The ones tagged not enough to escalate." "Yeah," the friend said. "Why?" Adrian replied. "Because I think it's time we stopped calling silence a protocol." That list had 16 names. 16 women. 14 were women of color. All had filed complaints for public harassment or discrimination in stores, parking lots, banks, schools. None had moved forward. Some were under review. Others were unsubstantiated. But now they weren't just cases. They were patterns. Adrian looped in a colleague from civil rights. Together, they pulled complaint logs from the past 5 years. It took 3 days. They found over 200 reports that had been shelved, not due to lack of evidence, but due to lack of attention. And Selah's case. It became the wedge, the example, the undeniable footage. The Bureau scheduled a closed-door session to discuss internal bias in report processing. Caden was asked if he wanted to attend. He declined. "Let the system talk to itself for once," he said. Instead, he stayed home, held Selah's hand during her 3rd trimester appointment, listened to the heartbeat of the child they almost tried to scare out of her. Inside the Bureau, the conversation began quietly. Then came louder voices. Then came names. Agents began speaking about times they'd seen similar behavior and stayed silent. Supervisors admitted they deprioritized low-violence complaints. Someone in IT found an old database note. No video. Her word against theirs. Someone else added, her word should have been enough. One agent, who'd worked in intake, resigned. Not from guilt, from clarity. "If I can't protect the quiet voices, I don't deserve to speak loud." 2 weeks later, the Bureau released an internal memo. New protocol. All harassment complaints, regardless of injury, to be evaluated with civil rights criteria. Repeat offender tracking across federal contractors. Dashcam footage review prioritized. Officers trained to recognize escalation patterns, not just physical harm, but targeted intimidation. The memo ended with a single quote. "Silence is no longer a neutral act." Selah received a call that day from Adrian. She didn't know her, but Adrian said, "Because of what you endured, something moved. You didn't just survive it. You made it count." Selah thanked her, then hung up, and cried for the first time since the incident. Not from pain, from release. The offers came in fast. News networks, talk shows, nonprofits wanting to make Selah the face of grace under pressure. Publishers offered book deals. One company even proposed a short documentary. But Selah turned down every one of them. Not because she was afraid, because she didn't owe anyone a performance. Justice wasn't about applause. It was about clarity. So she did something else. She signed one document, a federal affidavit, not to press charges, but to close a gap. It allowed her testimony to be entered into the new protocol training for all federal officers. Her words would be read, not aired, not quoted, taught, and remembered. Meanwhile, Caden moved differently too. He no longer briefed his team with slides. He used stories, examples, micro decisions that shaped outcomes. One morning, he brought in Selah's affidavit and read part of it aloud to a room full of agents. Then he folded it shut and said, "This isn't just a case file. This is who we protect, even when they don't scream loud enough for a headline." No one said a word, but they listened differently after that. Russell Kane took a plea deal, lost his security license, agreed to a 2-year federal probation, and 200 hours of community education work on racial bias. David McKinley was removed from all federal contractor work. Quietly, permanently. Tom Irwin refused the deal. He wanted to fight, but his lawyer reviewed the footage, the transcripts, the public reaction, and then advised him to settle. Irwin agreed to a civil liability judgment, unpaid, but permanent. It would show up on every background check for the rest of his life. Selah didn't show up to the final hearing. She didn't need to. Her name was already etched, not on the docket, but in the new officer handbook that agents were now required to sign. On the last page, under Case Application Example 03, Civilian Bias Incident, it read, Selah King, April 7th incident. Not prosecuted, but precedent. That evening, Selah sat on the back porch, feet up, one hand on her stomach. She watched the light fade across the yard. Micah came outside, her older nephew, home from college. He asked her, "Why didn't you take the spotlight? Why not speak louder?" Selah looked at him. "Because if the system doesn't change from what I whispered, then it was never going to change from what I shouted." Micah nodded, and for the first time, truly understood. The story didn't fade. It didn't explode either. It echoed. In classrooms, in training modules, in whispered conversations between officers who used to roll their eyes at sensitivity sessions, now sitting quietly through a training named after a woman they never met. The Selah King Protocol. It started as a memo, then became a module, then became a required certification. You couldn't carry a federal badge without passing it. And it wasn't just policy. It was presence, because the footage wasn't in the training, but the words were. Her words. Unflinching, undramatic, undeniable. At a community center in Richmond, a young black girl raised her hand during a training on knowing your rights. The officer leading it asked what she'd learned. She said, that when you walk like you matter, people who forget that get reminded. Her mother stood at the back of the room, quiet, proud, crying without showing it. At a federal training center, a veteran agent failed his first protocol test. Not because he didn't understand the law, but because he underestimated the weight of ignoring someone's humanity. He passed the second time. This time, he stayed after class, sat in silence, then said, I used to be one of the quiet ones. Never pushed. Never helped either. But I read her words. Now I can't go back. On a podcast, a DOJ attorney spoke briefly about the Selah King file. Didn't name names. Didn't tell stories. Just said, sometimes justice doesn't start with who's loudest. Sometimes it starts with the person who got up and never looked down. Caden never watched the echo unfold in full. He didn't need to. He saw it in how his team briefed differently, how community complaints were taken more seriously, how his own office asked fewer questions and listened more. Selah kept her life small, on purpose. She declined every new request. She taught Isaiah how to tie his shoes. She replanted the garden. She let the baby kick freely, hand always resting gently over the spot that hurt once, but healed stronger. And in small pockets across the country, people knew her name, not as a symbol, but as a standard. The moment the system flinched, because someone refused to. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't viral. But it was real. Tom Irwin showed up at the federal building one morning, not for a hearing, not to contest anything, just to drop something off. It was a letter, written in pen, in shaky cursive, addressed to Mrs. King. The front desk clerk didn't know what to do with it, so she gave it to Caden. He read it alone, didn't show it to Selah right away, because what it said wasn't for the world. It was for the woman he tried to erase. It began simply. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not writing to clear my name. I'm writing because what I saw in that room, when you didn't speak, said more than anything I ever thought I knew about strength. He talked about his father, about the fear he grew up around, the silence that became permission. He wrote, I thought I was better than the generation before me. But when I saw you, I didn't see a woman. I saw a threat that wasn't real, because it was easier to see you that way than to face myself. At the end, one sentence stood out. You didn't break me. You just showed me I was already broken. Caden folded the letter and slipped it into a drawer. He told Selah about it a week later. She asked, did he apologize? Caden nodded, but not for the push, for the blindness. Selah smiled, a small one, the kind that doesn't let someone in, but does acknowledge the door exists. Elsewhere, reckoning came quieter. Russell Kane sent a donation to a prenatal care nonprofit under Selah's name. Anonymous. But the routing traced back to his former employer's severance fund. He didn't want credit, just peace. David McKinley returned to school. Took night classes on biopsychology. He emailed Selah once. Didn't ask to meet. Just said, I'm not the same man who laughed that day. And I'm not trying to be seen. I'm trying to see. Selah never replied. But she didn't delete it either. One day, while shopping alone, a stranger approached her in the cereal aisle. A woman in her 60s. White, shaky voice. She said, I wasn't there when it happened, but I was there the day I laughed at something like it. I'm not asking for anything. I just thank you. Selah nodded, not because it was okay, but because someone had finally looked inward, not outward. At home, she wrote one thing in her journal. They didn't all become good, but some finally stopped pretending they were never part of the harm. The baby was born on a Tuesday. Quiet morning. No reporters. No headlines. Just breath. Selah didn't cry. She laughed. A deep, rich sound that filled the room as the nurse handed her the baby. A girl. Strong. Still. Eyes open. Already watching. Caden held them both, then stepped back. Not to leave, but to witness. The doctor said, she came early. Selah smiled. She came right on time. They named her Nia. It means purpose. Not as a statement. As a reminder. At home, the nursery was ready. Soft colors. Books. One quote on the wall, hand-painted by Micah. You belong. Always. Life didn't change overnight. The world didn't get softer. But it got clearer. Cleaner. More alert. Because after all that silence, people now paused before speaking. They paused before judging. Before laughing. Before pushing. That pause. That was Selah's legacy. One afternoon, Selah walked alone through the grocery parking lot. The same one. Not to relive anything. Just because she needed apples. A man held the door open for her, without flinching. A teenager moved his cart without comment. Two women smiled. Not in pity. In presence. That was enough. She stood by her car for a moment. Looked up at the camera mounted on the pole. It blinked red, still recording. Still watching. But this time, it wasn't watching for harm. It was watching because someone once made the system look back at itself. And it never forgot how. Back home, Selah sat on the porch with Nia sleeping on her chest. Micah passed by and asked, Is it over? Selah shook her head. No, but it's different now. He asked, How will we know when it is? She replied, When someone like her walks through the world, and no one needs to be reminded that she belongs. The wind moved gently. The house was quiet. Selah stood, not to return, not to fight, not to perform, but to live, in the kind of peace that doesn't ask permission. She folded the baby's blanket, held the door open, and stepped inside, not to close the story, but to continue it on her own terms.